Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is an extension of my news videos this morning and it concerns Niger and the coup there. I just wanted to give you a further bit of analysis. I have what I recorded earlier and then I just cut that off because it's too long, and I'm just going to sew it on the end of what I'm going to say here. So I hope the flow kind of works, but it's just going to be like bosh and bosh. Hey, it is what it is. Right, so we're talking about Niger. Just first of all, where is Niger? So Niger is a country slap in the middle of Africa, really kind of northern Africa. You've got the Sahara Desert around here. It is surrounded by Chad to the east, Nigeria to the south, and then you've got Burkina Faso, Mali, Algeria, Libya. So it's landlocked and supposedly one of the outposts left in the region of Western influence. So France has had traditionally a lot of historical influence, sort of colonial influence in this whole area. There's a lot of francophone countries that speak French, but they have been kind of kicked out of Mali recently, kicked out of Burkina Faso, and replaced in terms of influence by Russia. Russia also has influence in Algeria, has influence in Egypt as well, growing influence there. I'm not sure about Sudan, but quite possibly Wagner influence in a whole number of places where there are diamonds and probably uranium and other natural resources. I'm sure Wagner aren't far behind. It kind of reminds me, there's a board game called Twilight Struggle, where it's like, you know, the battle over the world in terms of US and USSR in the Cold War. Well, actually, that is kind of like a modern iteration of that is playing out here. And as I say later, it is a bit of a zero-sum game. So where Russia gain influence, that's at the expense of the US and Western allies. So, you know, this will affect the US, and the US has a large base, $100 million military base, a drone base in Niger that is used to keep a tab on growing jihadist militancy in the region. And of course, with a Russian-backed coup in Niger, that brings that base really sharply into focus. Just recently, I mean, this came out since my news piece, or I saw it after I did my news piece this morning that you'll hear in a minute. The spokesperson for the CNRD, the Colonel Aminata Diallo, announced today that Guinea is in full support of the military junta in Niger, and it will not follow the sanctions recently implemented by ECOWAS. So who are they? ECOWAS are the Economic Community of West African States. So this is a bunch of states, 15 countries located in West Africa who act collectively in an economic and security way, a bit like, I guess, maybe the African Union as a larger group, similar to that, and maybe sort of NATO and so on and so forth. So ECOWAS have come out against the coup in Niger, but Guinea here are saying that they are not going to support the sanctions recently implemented by ECOWAS. They further state that if they are requested by ECOWAS to conduct offensive action against Niger, they will refuse to comply. The CNRD, or National Committee of Reconciliation and Development, is the current ruling military junta of Guinea that has been in power since a coup d'etat in September 2021. Since this coup occurred, Guinea has been suspended from the ECOWAS membership. So I don't know about Guinea, but whether there is Russian influence there as well. It's all quite controversial. So Guinea is there. That is not right next to Niger, but close enough to be an important influence on Niger, regionally. So that is what they've said. Tatarigami here has a really big Q&A that I'm going to just dip into, introducing a great interview on Africa's geopolitics featuring who is it? So this is Sim Tak, a geopolitical analyst, strategic intelligence reflector thereof. military analyst as well. So an experienced military and intel analyst who covered regional conflicts for prominent firms like Stratfor. We discuss Mali, Wagner and Niger coup, offering insights into Africa's complexity. So let's have a look at this. So recently, multiple events like a coup in Niger and ongoing turmoil in countries like Mali and Burkina Faso have captured global attention. To provide some context, could you please offer a concise overview of the current situation in the region? And he answers, through recent events, a trend is showing that local democratic traditions and international cooperation are being replaced by authoritarianism. This is democratic backsliding around the world, and are being replaced by authoritarianism and crude, uninformed efforts at securitization. Niger is just the last in a series of the countries following Mali and Burkina Faso to fall victim to military juntas that managed to capitalize on local political grievances and frustration with Western security operations. Meanwhile, violent extremist organizations roam the territories of these countries unabated, while local minorities are persecuted under the guise of counter-terrorism operations. So the next question is, how do you assess the significance of the recent changes in the region, especially given that many people may not consider regional African issues as highly important? Do these changes pose any risks to international security? The answer, there are definitely many risks associated with the rise of authoritarian regimes and the uncontrolled operation of jihadist groups in the Sahel region. These risks don't solely consist of trans-regional terrorist threats, but also come in the form of disruptions to development and stability efforts that will continue to sow the seeds of future crises and conflict. Now, of course, that's because it's not just that these nations exist on their own and have no connection to the wider world. They export loads of really important natural resources, uranium being Niger's big export there, that France is dependent on, and then the countries that import energy from France, like Germany, are dependent on France, that are dependent on Niger. So this is really, really important. Another question, you mentioned the risks associated with the rise of jihadist groups. How united are they and who are they? The answer is the main jihadist actors to the west of Niger are ISGS, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, so kind of like ISIS, and JNIM, an Al-Qaeda affiliate group that combines AQIM, Ansar al-Dina, Murabitun, and others. These groups actually compete with each other, as has traditionally been the case in other theatres where Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliates both occur. So we've seen that in Afghanistan, actually, and in the Middle East in a wider context. To the southeast of Niger, you have the remnants of Boko Haram in the Lake Chad area. So Boko Haram is an issue in Nigeria. They are an Islamic group that operates in the north of Nigeria. Nigeria has a lot more Western influence because of the oil there. And so it's in some sense a lot kind of safer from these kind of activities. However, the north of Nigeria is a bit of a problem, and there's a lot of Islamic fundamentalism that is wreaking havoc in the north there. It goes on to say, in the south of Niger, you have the remnants of Boko Haram in the Lake Chad area, which are now split between an Al-Qaeda affiliated part, still commonly known as Boko Haram, and an Islamic State affiliate known as ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province, while their areas of operations are today still separated by Niger, and thus is why stability in Niger is so critical. The respective IS and AQ affiliations across these theatres provide a foundation for collaboration between them. Question, over the past year, what are the most noticeable changes in the Sahel region, and have any discernible trends emerged? The answer is perhaps the most notable, in addition to the most recent coup in Niger, has been the announced end of UN peacekeeper operations in Mali. This is, of course, follows earlier moves by Mali and Burkina Faso to ban French forces from operating against jihadist groups on their territories, and now leaves the entire responsibility for security in these countries in the hands of the unprepared local security forces and Wagner Group with its crude, indiscriminate methods. In other words, Wagner are now active there and have effectively replaced both French troops and UN peacekeepers. I mean, that is a significant change in geopolitical terms. The stability of these areas is under the influence of Russia. Russia is responsible for the stability, not the West, not the UN. really quite important change there. A major fear is now that Niger could follow the same trend. Let's turn our attention back to Niger. Could you please provide a brief overview of the recent events that have unfolded in Niger and discuss the potential implications for the future? The answer is Niger in recent years became one of the main countries where France and other Western nations had relocated their security efforts after being banished from Mali and Burkina Faso. Niger holds a critical geographical position between the territories plagued by the groups like AQIM and IS affiliates to the west, and the Lake Chad area to the southeast, where Boko Haram separate IS affiliates operate. The removal of civilian government in Niger and the potential political ramifications of a military junta turning against the Western nations that condemn them could expose Niger to accelerated destabilization. This in turn would further expand the existing regional power vacuum that all these violent extremist organizations have been exploiting for over a decade. Question: with the growing presence of Wagner in the region, its influence has become a matter of concern for many, including myself. Could you shed some light on the extent of their impact on the regional and on the region and Africa overall, and how serious the situation is? So the answer: Wagner Group has operated as one of the instruments of Russian influence in Africa and the Sahel region in particular, by providing promises of security capabilities without having to bend to Western demands of democracy or human rights. The situation is this: like, the UN and Western forces will say, right, we're going to give you security assurances, but you have to have transparency, you have to have these democratic ideals and mechanisms, so on and so forth. And when the power is concentrated in relatively few people, they don't want to concede that power or cede that power to anyone else, so they will rather take the option that allows them to maintain power, maybe increase their power and riches. It's money as well. And democracy can take that away. The will of the people can just say, right, you're no longer in power, these guys are in power. And actually that's a real threat. So a regime that already has authoritarian bent to them will want to maintain that focus of power. And Wagner saying, yeah, we'll give you security assurances. Yeah, what do you want in return? Oh, just a bunch of money and like some of that uranium and or some of that gold or some of that oil. Yeah, okay, right. And we get to keep power? Yeah, you can do whatever you like. I don't give a damn if you go around doing human rights abuses left, right, and centre, because, hey, I'm just a mercenary organisation. So if you want to do that, go for it. What we're going to do is kill whoever you want us to kill and keep this natural resource right here safe. And by safe, I mean under our control and your control. But, you know, we'll work together on that one. That's what happens. So, you know, democracy will lose, transparency will lose, because that is far more attractive to someone who is in power, wants to keep power, wants to increase power, has loads of riches, and wants to increase their riches. Just, yeah. It's so difficult for the West to prevail here. As it continues, this has become a very popular, albeit short-sighted narrative in the region. However, Wagner is unable to make true on the promise of security due to their own limited capabilities and unsophisticated methods. At the end of the day, Russia is marking some secondary geopolitical victories in the West, primarily through the disruption of long-term stability efforts, while Wagner and other Russian companies are reaping financial benefits. The highest damage that Russia is doing in Africa is rolling back efforts to develop mature political systems and develop local economies. This creates a more favourable terrain for Russian influence and military relations, but at the cost of African societies. In other words, Russia gains small loci of power gain. The African people at large in those regions don't gain, because you'll get greater inequality, less democracy, more authoritarianism, human rights abuses, so on and so forth. Question: in a recent thread, I highlighted evidence suggesting that Wagner may gain access to third-party technologies like the Turkish TB2 through their African proxies. Is this concern valid, and to what extent does this risk pose a serious problem? Answer: the concern is certainly valid. There have been strong indicators of direct interaction of Wagner personnel with TB2 drones purchased by Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. Both also operate the system. The cooperation of these countries with Russia make it incredibly risky to share any sensitive technology or capabilities with them. Even if this equipment is not handed over to Russia, the exposure of sensitive elements means that Russia will be better positioned to counter or reverse engineer such solutions itself. This also puts the providers of such equipment in a difficult position, as they will have to incorporate the impact of changing geopolitical allegiances in their business development. Question: as an observer of Africa, what key developments or trends should we closely monitor in the next 3 to 6 months? Answer: the most immediate questions on my mind relate to the consequences of the coup in Niger and the pending withdrawal of UN forces from Mali. In Niger, it will be interesting to see how the new leadership behaves towards Russia, but especially how it interacts with France and other Western partners. The big question is whether France and others will be able to sustain security operations in the Sahel from the territory of Niger. When it comes to the UN withdrawal from Mali, which is still underway following the expiration of the mandate on June the 30th, the question is, how will this affect security in different parts of Mali? On the one hand, this raises the risk of increased freedom of movement of jihadist groups, but on the other hand, it also removes one of the few remaining limitations against widespread violence against civilians perpetrated by the Malian military and Wagner. So that, I think, was a really interesting Q&A on Niger. Gives you a really good basis, foundation to understand the geopolitical context within which the coup is situated. I'm now going to go back to what I recorded earlier on in my news piece, so there might be a bit of a random sort of movement to what I was saying there. I don't think there's too much where I'm repeating myself. There's a lot of talk about France's involvement vis-a-vis energy and uranium, which I think is so vital to understand here. Over to me. And this kind of comes on to where I've been kind of leading. Russia is not destabilizing the African continent at all, says Noel Report sarcastically. Breaking: Mali and Burkina Faso says that they will go to war alongside the coup leaders in Niger in the event of an ECOWAS invasion. So if the African nations come and support Niger, then actually Burkina Faso and Mali will come to the support of the coup. Now, what you need to know is Burkina Faso and Mali have kicked out the French recently and taken on Russian influence. So this is all about Russian influence in sub-Saharan Africa, in the African continent. This is hugely important geopolitically and in terms of energy. So I'm going to dwell on this for a little bit because it's that bloody important. Right. Military regime in Niger has, with immediate effect, banned the export of uranium to France. Over 50% of the uranium ore extracted from Niger, I've heard it's 100%, is used for fueling French nuclear power plants. 24% of EU uranium imports come from Niger, right? Although the argument is actually Niger needs France more than France needs Niger. But nonetheless, so here we have, this is the Telegraph, just dipping Daily Telegraph, saying both the US and France have sent troops and hundreds of millions of dollars of military and humanitarian aid in recent years to Niger, which was a French colony until 1960. The country was seen as the last working with the West against extremism in a francophone region where anti-French sentiment had opened the way for the Russian private military group Wagner. So there's this, Wagner has either prompted or exacerbated anti-French anti-colonial feelings in some of these nations, and Niger is the last one that is kind of pro-West and is helping to fight against Islamic extremism, amongst other things, in that area of Africa. After neighbouring Mali and Burkina Faso ousted the French military and began working with Wagner mercenaries, Antony Blinken visited Niger in March to strengthen ties and announce $150 million in direct assistance, calling the country a model of democracy. And of course, now you've seen a coup. Now, what are the choices? Well, cut off all the money, and you're starting to see that. Lots of people saying, right, we're not giving you money. Then does it, what happens then? I mean, it could go either way. It becomes disastrous in terms of its economy and in terms of the welfare of the people, and then that leads more often than not to extremism and things. So it could end up being a vicious cycle as you pull out. But then you don't want to support a coup that is ostensibly against your position and against you directly. So, of course, we're not going to fund that. So, but these are the prickly geopolitical calculations. So this is another Telegraph article that says, as crowds chant long live Putin and down with France. So this is what they were chanting in Niger. Some supporters attempted to storm the entrance before the crowd was dispersed by Nigerian soldiers firing tear gas. So this is at the French embassy. Emmanuel Macron warned that anyone who attacked French nationals or diplomats would meet immediate and intractable retaliation. Niger has been seen as the last reliable partner in the West in efforts for the West in efforts to battle the jihadists in Africa's Sahel region, where Russia and Western countries have vied for influence. France has 1,500 soldiers in the country who conduct joint operations with the Nigerians. Rather than they're Nigerian soldiers. That's not Nigerian soldiers. So they're Nigerian. One letter difference, big difference in what I'm talking about. Right, okay. So a little bit more about this, and this is where we'll finish today. So this is again the Telegraph, how a pro-Putin Putin coup threatens Europe's nuclear supplies. This is why it's so bloody important, and why we all need to take notice of this. Okay, okay. So let's actually go to the full quote here. Daniel Foubert, founder of consulting firm Excalibur Insights, says this creates risks for European energy security. I think it could generate a new energy crisis if Russia does in Africa what it does in Ukraine, he says. If they cannot conduct such a war in Europe, why not in Africa when nobody is looking? The French are not interested, but they should be, says Melissa Lawford, I think, who's writing this. Niger produces about 5% of the world's uranium, a crucial component in nuclear power, but it exports all of it to France, which sources 70% of its electricity from nuclear sources. Sayan Gohil, a risk analyst at Fitch Solutions, says, quote, Niger is more dependent on uranium exports to France than France is dependent on uranium imports from Niger. But the coup highlights a wider problem with uranium, which is not under sanctions. Nearly 2/3 of France's uranium imports in 2022 came from countries now in Russia's sphere of influence. Wow. But it gets more interesting still, as we'll come on to see. Last year, 30% of France's uranium imports came directly from Russia. A further 12% and 9.6% came from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, respectively, both former Soviet states. That is relatively concerning, as France relies on nuclear power, says Gohil. He notes that there have been 7 coups across West and Central Africa in the last 3 years alone. A jihadist insurgency has been spreading from Mali. Niger was a key Western ally in the region, as increasingly important one after the Mali and Burkina Faso kicked out the French troops stationed there. There is a clear pattern. Russia has already established a clear influence in Mali and reportedly in Burkina Faso following similar coups, Gohil says. Quote, the lesson is that this is a key risk that Niger will move away from relying on France and the US and move towards Russia. France also exports energy to Germany. So this is the bit where I was saying it gets more interesting still. Quote, there are regional implications for nuclear power in Europe, says Gohil. Overall, the European Union gets a quarter of electricity from nuclear power. So France is a massive nuclear energy nation. It gets a lot of its uranium from either Niger, which is now under the influence of Russia, or Russia directly, or Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And so therefore, Russia has a massive influence on French energy, which is then exporting energy to, among other places, Germany. So therefore, by extension, Germany is under the influence, not only, as we've seen with hydrocarbons, which has weaned itself off, but even if it says, well, we import energy from France. Yeah, but France is under the influence of Russia. So this is just so important. So he says, if demand wasn't rising, that would not be a problem, but it is, says Philip Andrew Speed, Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Prices have climbed steadily and steeply from January 2021 to January 2023. The price of uranium rose by 74%. In the first 6 months of this year, it has climbed by a further 11%. Quote, Britain is talking about wanting new reactors. Poland and Romania are likely to move ahead with nuclear. Turkey is building its first nuclear power plant. Finland has another one. There is a big argument made for energy security and relatively green energy, says Andrew Speed. This was boosted by the energy crisis. Russia's presence could also disrupt the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline. So this is another area of worry where Niger has huge influence, and the whole region has influence over energy security. So you've got the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline, which is planned to run from Nigeria through Niger to Europe as part of the strategy to diversify Europe's gas supplies away from Russia. Once completed, this will send around 30 billion cubic meters of natural gas to Europe per year, enough to satisfy demand for about 30 million European homes. This is expected to replace a sizable chunk of the 155 billion cubic meters that Europe used to import from Russia. Quote, that could be a reason for Russia to immediately try and build very close ties with the new military junta and potentially blockade this project, says Gohil. However, Putin is unlikely to have the economic means to do this, he adds, but the Russian presence in Niger in itself could also bolster its war effort in Ukraine. Their modus operandi is gold, quote, he says. Wagner isn't necessarily interested in uranium, but gold can provide tangible value and they can send reserves back to Russia. That is what they've been doing in other African countries, says Gohil. Fresh gold reserves will also stabilize the economy back home in Russia. So this then goes back to what I was saying earlier about the things they're doing to stabilize the ruble. They've been absolutely churning through their reserves. Half of their reserves have been expended so far, possibly more now since the beginning of the war. But if they can replenish those reserves with gold reserves from the countries that they have huge influence over in Africa, then that allows them to continue executing their war efforts, and that is so. What's going on in Africa has massive ramifications for what's taking place inside Russia and therefore inside Ukraine, and indeed inside Europe in terms of energy. It's just it's all so important, and this is why when okay, this might not directly affect the US, but when people say this doesn't affect us, right? Everything in the world affects everyone when you're talking about these kind of geopolitical things. When you're talking about Islamic extremism, if you're worried about that in the States, then actually, where is it being brought to fruition? Where are the fertile grounds for Islamic extremism to grow? Well, actually, in the relatively infertile lands of sub-Saharan Africa. So all these things are connected, and it is why America has a strategic plan that many people outside of those areas of government, either outside of ruling administrations or outside of national defense and foreign policy creation, people either just the general public in the US or people who are appealing to the general public by saying things and are politicians, but they aren't involved in these kind of decisions and don't have this kind of knowledge, are saying things about, we shouldn't be putting our money into this and we shouldn't be actually just don't know what they're talking about. The world is an integrated mesh of geopolitical strategies and it's a big geopolitical chess game, and America is the biggest player. And if it wants to maintain itself at the top of that hegemony, the center of that hegemony, that supreme power around the world, then stuff like this is deeply, deeply important. Yes, this may affect France and Germany and Europe more in terms of energy, but it is massively important because they have we'll just go and find out. We'll come on to why it affects America quite a lot in a second. So, sorry, to get back to it. This is what they've been doing in other African countries, says Gohil. Fresh gold reserves will also stabilize the economy back home in Russia. Crucially, there's a massive threat to regional instability. Russia is steadily building a sphere of influence in opposition to the West, argues Daniel Fubert. This is a zero-sum game. So if Russia are gaining influence in Africa, the US are losing influence. Quote, they are slowly expanding and it is becoming extremely dangerous. Russia will be able to use its presence in Africa as a way to put pressure on other important countries. They already have the very good relations with Algeria, a big presence in eastern Libya, and strong relations with Egypt. We are slowly being cut off from the global south. Gohil at Fitch Solutions adds, Mali and Burkina Faso, following coups and close ties with Russia, effectively kicked France out and told the UN security mission to leave as well. So Niger was one of the last countries still firmly Western aligned in the region. The US also has a $100 million drone base in the country. I think this was like the biggest military construction installation that Americans built for like however long or whatever. This is really significant. It's a key linchpin in the fight against terrorist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the region, says Gohill. Western African states are unlikely to fall within Russia's sphere of influence as their economies are more robust. Russia's sphere is more likely to spread east. Chad might be a potential target, says Gohill. Russia's creep is its own form of colonialism, taking over the power vacuum left by France. Quote, I think Macron is very weak, says Foubert. The French president is grappling with protests at home. There is no real strategy to fight Russia. It's insufficient. I mean, that's a problem with France having all its issues at home as it wants to increase, say, the retirement age from 62, which it absolutely should do. Right, I'm with Macron 100% here. The retirement age has to be raised in Russia. The population, the demographics cannot be sustained with the retirement being at 62. But all the people in France, well, many of the workers in France don't want that to happen. So they're going on strike. Then there are protests. Then there's riots. And there's all this stuff. Meanwhile, stuff is going down, shite is going down over in Africa that is not in France's interest. And so trying to juggle all these things. Meanwhile, you know, the US has a $100 million drone base, which is super, super important in Niger. And Niger's just had a coup. And it's Russia that are the ones either behind it or jumping on the back of it. And it's just one hot mess. And it's every month, Russia are increasing their influence in the region. And the West's influence is draining. So this is hugely important, and that's why I thought I had to talk about it at some length. Anyway, sorry that I took up such a long time talking about it. I hope it's interesting. It is important. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.